But if just as a punishment, you ground the child, they can't go out, they can't play with their friends, you are robbing them of such an important social contact. Now they're going to feel excluded, and you're going to have a resentful, bitter, sour child stomping around the home. That's not helpful for anybody.
Welcome to Awake at the Wheel. In today's episode, we're going to be addressing some parenting strategies. I'm going to just come out and say it. There's a lot of really bad parenting advice out there. So I just came across an article in the Washington Post. I had never heard of this person before, but apparently this woman, Ruby Frank, she had millions of followers on YouTube. She had a YouTube channel called 8 Passengers. Recently, however, she was arrested. She was charged with child abuse, and this is somebody who was influencing millions of parents out there as far as different tools and strategies. So I think that's just one of many examples, certainly an extreme one. But this compelled me to select this as a topic as far as, what are the questions that parents have out there? So I scoured the internet a little bit and found what some of the main questions are that parents are asking. But Oren, I'm curious, what's some bad parenting advice or parenting influencers that you've come across recently?
Well, I think the worst one, and I'm blanking on the name for some reason, because there's different names for it, basically. I think it's egalitarian parenting is one, where they're misunderstanding authoritative parenting. So basically, so there's authoritarian, permissive, and authoritative. I think we've talked about this before, right?
Yeah.
Right. So just for people who didn't watch it, authoritarian is it's my way or the highway. Authoritative is there are rules, boundaries, expectations, but the parents explain it to the kids. They explain why these are in place. They explain consequences and so on. So it's not just do it or else, right? So and then there's the overly permissive parenting or neglectful parenting. So in any event, so the egalitarian parenting. Or there may be other names, but when I read it years ago,
I think gentle parenting is one of them.
Gentle parenting. Okay. There's another one that's called, no parenting. Or that's like, we can talk about that as well. But this idea that kids had an equal say in everything. We're talking even young children. And so some people take it so far that if a parent makes a child eat, I'm not talking making them eat every single pea off their plate, but if the kid doesn't want to eat, the parent's like, okay, well, you'll just eat when you want to eat, okay? Or you don't want to go to school. That's okay. I'll stay home from work and I will. And people might think I'm exaggerating, but I've seen people do this kind of
It's really happening.
Does happen. So that's probably the worst I've seen, treating kids like adults.
Yeah. So yesterday, in preparation for this, I asked some of our staff, what are their parenting questions? Because we work with a lot of parents. 2 funny ones came up, so I'll mention those. One person said, "Why the F did I have kids? Can you answer that for me?" I said, "Well, I don't think we can." And the second was, "How do I get my kids to listen?" I'm like, "Okay, well, that's a good one." So that's actually one that did come up in my searching online as far as, some of the top questions. But I'm just going to jump in, and here's what we're going to do. I'm going to read off the questions that I came across, and I think we'll kind of chime in with our 2 cents and, whether we agree with what some of the common wisdom is out there. So I hadn't heard of this one before. So one of the questions is, what is the 7-7-7 rule of parenting? So I looked it up, and I guess what it means is you play with your children for the first 7 years, and then you teach your children for the next 7 years, and then you advise them for the following 7 years. So I'll take this one first. I think that that's a recipe for disaster. Simply playing with your kid for the first 7 years, that's not going to cut it. And I think this ties into what you were saying earlier as far as, letting kids rule the roost and run the household. No, those first 7 years are fundamental in terms of helping them to understand the world around them, help them understand how to follow rules, help them to develop self-discipline by following discipline, and the list goes on. So right off the bat, I don't think I agree with that one.
Yeah. Now, the only slack I'm willing to cut is if they're saying, well, we're not being literal and this is kind of like a guiding thing. But from what I've seen, a lot of these times where you think, okay, they can't be being literal, they are. So yeah, you're absolutely right. Yes, that's ridiculous. Right? The kids need that guidance, advising everything throughout the entire time. You need to model for the children how to do certain things. There is a hierarchy. And as you're saying about kids understanding, like internalizing structure, internalizing discipline, understanding hierarchies. And I know we've talked before about this, where you kind of figure out, where are my strengths and weaknesses? And I have to learn pretty quickly what they are and try to develop certain ones, maybe abandon other ones to fit in the hierarchy, whatever that is. I mean, that's why younger kids usually, they end up being, jokesters or whatever, like, because, they somehow have to be the class clown or something to get attention within a large family, right? And if they're able to do that in a way that actually helps them, if it makes them more extroverted, if they learn to be humorous, which is a great talent and so on, wonderful, right? But if everybody's on a flat playing field, then the kids don't learn that. And then they go into the real world and they don't develop certain strengths. So or they don't realize that I shouldn't be doing this because it's not working for me.
And we're seeing it, right? I feel like I pick on Gen Z a lot, but that's what we're seeing with many individuals who are entering the workforce at this point, where they don't understand that hierarchy and, being subordinate. I don't mean that in a negative way, but we live in a world where there is a hierarchy. And interestingly, as we're talking about this, I think these, cutesy terms like the 777 rule, while they perhaps weren't intended to be taken literally, they are, because they're made in TikToks where it's, however many seconds of information being thrown at parents, and that's their parenting advice for the day.
Yeah, no, I agree. And it's lazy, right? And it can also make someone neurotic because you're getting all this, I would say, discrepant, contradictory information, because I'm hoping that there's something different from the 777 that we're going to talk about. But yeah, this just, and I mean, but even parents who join, like, let's say, respectable groups, or there's a mummy blog or mummy group or whatever. Okay. Like, even then people have to be critical thinkers. Every advice doesn't work for every parent or every child. They're so different. And that's why you and I always take pains to be nuanced and to put these caveats in everything, because we know it's not a one size fits all solution, but so many people do that. And look, I don't blame everybody, because before you might pick up a book, you might watch a program or something, or a video. Now with social media everywhere, everyone's got a blog, everyone's got a TikTok video. There's just so much. So it's hard for people to know, who do I trust?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. So the next question I came across here, and I was surprised that it's phrased this way as frequently as it is, but how do you discipline a child without yelling or hitting? So before I give my thoughts on this, I guess I'll say that I will insert my own personal beliefs in this one. So without yelling or hitting, I guess I will preface with, I personally don't believe that spanking is a helpful tool. In some cases it can be, and there are rules. We're in Canada here, so there are rules surrounding, what is acceptable. My last look at the law, it was no blows to the face, only an open hand, no objects, above the age of 2, and I think below the age of 13. So if I'm misquoting that, forgive me, but that's the general guidance. That aside, though, I think that, one of the challenges with hitting or spanking is that it in ways does teach the child that hitting is okay, or that hitting is an appropriate response in a bad situation. That being said, sometimes there is a time and a place for physical discipline if it's done within the parameters of the law and done in a context that is appropriate to your child. Some children are just too sensitive for that type of discipline. It's going to backfire. But if they put themselves in severe danger, for example, sometimes a gentle physical reminder of what they've done wrong could be appropriate. So that's my take on that piece. As far as yelling, how do you discipline without yelling? Well, you should always discipline without yelling, because one of the golden rules is, we don't discipline out of anger, whether that's, through raising our voice or through physical discipline or whatever the case may be. So ensuring that you are in a mind space to be able to have a constructive conversation with your child is incredibly important. Back to modeling and showing your child that you can discuss difficult things without, blowing your lid.
Right. And so I always tell people, especially when I'm working with parents, I say, I'm a court appointed, I may have said this before, but I say I'm a court appointed parenting expert. And I say, if you say that to my kids, they'll laugh in your face. Okay. So, and I always tell them, it's great on paper. I say, everything I'm telling you It's the best way to parent. And I say, I wish I could do this. I try my best. Sometimes I do, work in line with what I'm saying. Other times I don't, because of my own history, my own reflexes and so on. So what I tell parents is, I say, you have to, you're trying to follow these rules, but you also have to have some self-compassion and recognize you're going to be triggered. And if you do that, if you do lose your cool, if you do yell or snap or something, I'm talking about verbal, I'm not talking about physical. When it's physical, I take it to another level of saying, okay, now you've crossed a line. Because as you say, it's got to be done properly. And I think we talked about this before. It's got to be done in a disciplinary manner. Normally, but when people spank, usually it's done out of anger, as you were saying, right? That's not discipline. That's just lashing out. That's right. So it's not teaching the child the right things. It's teaching them might makes right. Okay. And teaching them to be afraid of the parent. And we'll talk about that. There's a valuable component to fear. Not everyone will agree. We'll talk about that later. But back to the yelling. If somebody loses it, I say, you have to, you look at what was the trigger. You do your best to try, to always try to be mindful of that. You do breathing or other techniques to ground you. Okay. And I say, and again, you do that with compassion, because if you shame yourself, you're not going to learn. You have to, you don't make excuses. You don't pretend it's something that it's not. Okay. You own it. And again, not everyone will agree. I don't know how you don't agree, but I know that when I lose my cool with my kids, I don't care how old they were. Every single time. And I don't care if it was, a major escalation on my part or just a little one. Okay, it didn't matter if it went beyond a healthy, discipline without yelling or without raising the voice. I went to them afterwards, and I don't care how old they were. I wanted to model for them and for myself. I apologized, and I said, Daddy had a temper tantrum. I said, I blew up. I said, here's why I got upset. This is what you did. That was wrong. Here's why it's wrong. I said, but my reaction was not right. I said, it was too much, and I am so sorry. And I said, I'm trying to do better and everything like that. We all make mistakes and stuff like that. So, because I don't want them to internalize my own neuroses, my own failures, because that's what they're going to do. They're not going to think, oh, Daddy lost his cool if I don't say anything. They're going to think, oh my God, I'm a horrible person. I mean, they're not going to think those words, right? For little kids, but I did something horrible that deserves, him yelling. And I never want them to internalize that. So I make darn sure that, that I tell them that. And that's what parents can do. Is it perfect? No, it does mitigate it somewhat, however.
No, and I think that's such a great point. And I'll add in here, by no means are either of us perfect parents. I've lost count of how many times my child has told me I'm being too yelly. So similarly, I will take that moment of, reflection and recognize when I've been out of line with my response as far as, raising my voice and having an improper tone and whatever the case may be. And I guess I'll pat myself on the back here, because in having these conversations afterwards, like you've described, my child then feels comfortable to put me in check, and not in a disrespectful way, but to remind me that I am being too yelly. Right. So I think that that's an important thing for people to take away from this, is that, it goes both ways. If you communicate that, you were wrong, they're going to feel comfortable in having that open line of communication with you. Right.
And I just want to add one more thing. I don't just say that after the fact. But even though I do every time, I will sometimes randomly, and when they're a bit older, because if they're 2 or 3 years old, they're not going to remember. But when they were 7 or 10 or 5, okay, I would say days later, sometimes months later, I would say, even with my oldest one, okay, who I haven't yelled at for a long time, I would still say to her sometimes, she's in her mid-20s. I would say to her, just remember, I've said this to you so many times, okay, any time from the past, that I lost my cool or whatever. I said, that was on me. Right? I said, don't internalize that. So I say, and again, even when they're younger children, just 5, 10 years old, whatever, out of the blue, I just say, hey, you know what? Remember a few weeks ago? I said, I was just really thinking about that, and it's that was so silly, that was so dumb. I'm ashamed, I'm embarrassed. I would say that because I want them to know, not just in that moment, but you know what? I am thinking about you. Right? I am. And I'm taking accountability. I always say that. I'm not making excuses. Yes. I go, there's no excuse. It's full accountability, because again, I don't want them to think that they don't deserve that. If I screw up, they are human beings who deserve to be told that I screwed up, and they deserve to have me trying to make amends in some way. That helps give the child a sense of self-esteem or self-value, because they say, yeah, I deserve that. That my parent is, trying to do right by me after he screwed up.
And I think that accountability is incredibly important, that piece of it, because I imagine that some may interpret this as, well, it's weak to tell your parent or your children that you were wrong. You're the parent. No, not at all. Accountability is incredibly important to model for children, again, so that they can see, okay, sometimes we lose our cool, sometimes we make mistakes, but that's okay. Own up to it and move on.
Right. And it's one thing I say this to my students. I put in my book. One thing that my parents told me, I don't know how old I was. Probably, I know it was before my sister came. So I was probably around maybe 6, maybe 5 or 6, maybe 7. I was with my brother, a couple of years older. And my parents basically said to us, they said, we don't know what we're doing. All right. My mom was 21 when she had me. My dad was a hippie. Well, they were hippies and everything. They had no idea. And they said that to me. Again, I was 5 or 6 years old. But here, I still remember that because they certainly did not know what they were doing in many cases. And so I still remember as a kid, when I'd see this happening, I would do that analysis of, oh my God, my mom lost her shit again. I mean, I use different words, of course, okay, but I didn't internalize it. Like, and it's not saying, well, okay, so I could, burn the porch down or something. It's not that. It was just, but I could recognize when I did something wrong or when my parents were overreacting. And I've had other patients where they had horrific upbringings, but one parent or somebody in the family somehow delivered that message when they were young, and they kept delivering it that, that's not on you, right? You might have done something wrong, but your parents are, they're out there or something like that. And that in each case, it's only been a few cases where I've seen people who've had that experience, but I'm telling you, I've told them, I said, you should be much more messed up than you are. And then they would tell me what the parents said. I said, oh, that makes perfect sense. That again, mitigated some of the damage.
Well, it helps realign their understanding of reality.
Right. Exactly. Yes.
Yeah. So the next question I came across, and I actually saw a TikTok about this the other day. I'm not on TikTok. I watch a compilation of TikToks. I feel it necessary to point that out. But anyway, in any event, I wish I could remember the exact wording of it, but it was surrounding timeouts. So the next question that we're going to talk about here is, are timeouts okay? And in this video, multiple videos, actually, they were saying that they are developmentally inappropriate. They're not okay. It sends them a terrible message. It makes them feel alone. It isolates them. It punishes them. And it just goes on. I'm going to go ahead and disagree with that. So timeouts are good for kids and for adults. And we've talked about this in the past when we discussed even relationships and marriages, that taking a timeout and verbalizing that we need a timeout is incredibly valuable for adults. With regards to the developmental appropriateness of it, of course, you need to be mindful of the amount of time, because the attention span and ability for a child to connect, what happened with the amount of time that's passed, it's very important to understand that. General rule of thumb is the number of minutes can align with the number of years old that they are. I would even shorten that up a little bit, again, because you want to make sure that they understand the relationship between the punishment and what happened. But what's also happening with the timeout is it's giving them a moment to collect themselves. And, as a side note, if you are, and you should be, teaching your children great coping tools. So whether it's deep breathing, whether it's grounding themselves, whatever, tools are used in your household, that gives them the opportunity to take that moment, clear their head, reset, and then actually have a conversation about it. What I'll say about timeouts is, when it's timeout time, it's timeout time. You're not going and talking with them. You're not going and poking them. Let them have their few minutes.
Okay. So timeouts is tricky. So I used to do, I've done, I think 500 assessments for children's aid societies or child protective services and the courts across Ontario. And so I would observe parents with their kids. And it's interesting because I saw so many people try to use timeouts. Now, this was in an observation. It could be in a home or in an observation room. And I know there's a lot of pressure, okay, because they're being observed by the person who's assessing the family. I get that. Okay, but some other times, like, I could just see that they just don't know what they're doing. And it's interesting because within that, the many years I was doing these assessments, at some point, the timeout became, what's the right word? Verboten. So, so a parent would be doing a timeout because they learned it in a class, and then they'd have a caseworker saying, no, you're not allowed to do timeout, and it's wrong. Like, what? Like, it was suddenly changed. Right? It's really tricky. So, I understand the notion against timeouts, and I understand the reason to do them. If people do the timeouts the way that you said and explain to the kid, this is why you're doing it, it's giving us a chance to calm down, to breathe, to whatever, okay, all the power to you, then I think it's a good thing. Okay. Some of the arguments against it is that a lot of times that for the child, depending on the age, especially, that the timeout, it kind of excludes them from the family or from the person when they actually want to be there. Maybe they're anxious, maybe they're whatever, and they need that comfort and the contact or whatever. So it depends on the child, depends on the circumstance. And also it depends on the timeout. Some parents say, just say, go to your room. And for some kids, it's like, hey, great. My room's better than down here.
Yeah, that's not a punishment.
Okay. For other times, I've heard of where they lock the kid, close the door, and the kid's just pounding away and screaming and losing their shit. It's like that's not really helpful. Like you got to know, right? It's got to be set up the way you said. And other times, and you talk about not poking, whatever. And I would watch it, and they would put the kid in the chair, timeout chair. The kid would climb down. They'd do it. They put a kid in again. Kid would climb off. Put it in again. Okay. And eventually they just give up. Right. So you just taught your child, persistence pays off, right? No matter what you say, no matter what you're trying to do, if the kid just pushes hard enough, they get their way. So again, if someone can master the timeout in the way that you're describing, and if they say as well, hey, you know what? I sometimes take a timeout as well. It's not a punishment. As long as they say it's not a punishment. You wouldn't use the word collaborative with the kid, but it's a way for us to get along better. Let us catch if it's sold properly, it can be a good tool. I have rarely seen it used properly. I've seen it used properly a couple of times, but not often.
Yeah. So that actually leads nicely into the next question is, my kids don't listen. So is punishment okay? This is such a broad, strange question. And it ties back to what we spoke about in the beginning of this episode, as far as, there's rules in a household and they need to be enforced. Punishment's a tricky one, though, because I think it depends what people mean when they say punishment. Punishment has to be constructive. Right. It has to be age appropriate. It has to be illustrative of logical consequences for actions, because that's what we're trying to teach kids. That being said, there are certain kids that maybe won't respond as well to punishment. What we know from the literature is that children with ADHD, for example, often don't respond well to punishment. They respond better to reward. So with regard to punishment, it's really important to know your child, know what they respond to, know what they value. And I don't say that as far as, using it as a threat, but if we're looking at, rewards and punishment, seeing what is important enough to them that is going to motivate them and encourage them to abide by the rules.
Right. And we say what's important enough to them. It's either to try to get that or because they don't want to lose it, whatever that happens to be.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
And so especially with, let's say 10 to 12 and older. All right. I've told so many parents. So if you ground a kid, right. So not only are you depriving them of maybe a social engagement, right? Like let's see, there's a party going on or something like that. Assuming, I want to be clear here. If the child, let's say, came home drunk one time from the last party and they're having another party with those friends, it's totally appropriate to go, you know what, given last time, you're not going to go there, or we have to make sure that there's going to be parents or something like that. That would be appropriate. But if just as a punishment, you ground the child, they can't go out, they can't play with their friends, you are robbing them of such an important social contact. Now they're going to feel excluded, and you're going to have a resentful, bitter, sour child stomping around the home. That's not helpful for anybody. So what I tell parents is, instead of doing that, okay, you talk about seeking rewards. Okay, you can do that as well. In this case, the punishment, quote unquote, I had my kids do chores, and not your regular chores. Wash my car, clean the toilet, do something like that. And they said, but here's the thing. So there's a few things that people can do. So, and people are like, oh, wow, that makes so much more sense, right? Like they're actually doing something productive in the home. And I said, it's not about I tell them, it's like, again, I don't want to ground you. And I explain to them, I don't want you to be deprived of your social, contacts and everything. That's really important. So I say, so you're going to basically show that you can be a good citizen. And that's the verbiage. People can use different words, but I always talk with the parents I help, or the kids I help, or my own family. I say it's about being a good citizen within the home. So if you didn't do something, or if you hurt somebody or whatever else like that, you got to make amends. So be a good citizen, do this or that. If one of my daughters somehow wronged the other daughter, I would have the one who was wrong. She would take, they could either do her chores for a week or a day, or depending on the circumstances, or she can ask for something else. And we always had to make sure it was fair. Okay, my kids never made the other one do something really horrible, and they knew that we were overseeing it. Right. So again, it's about making amends. Saying, hey, I'm sorry, I screwed up. Here's how I'm going to do better, or here's how I'm going to make it up to you. Okay, and here's the part where I did it, And it's going to sound a bit cruel and sadistic, okay? But I think it's just strategic and clever, right, as a parent. So I would tell the kids, I would say, I'm not going to tell you what your punishment is going to be. Okay, I said, here's what you did wrong. I said, you get to choose your own punishment. Okay, now there's a catch. I say, I know what punishment I would choose. You got to choose your own. If it's not nearly as much as mine was going to be, okay, I'll give you a bit of a range, but if it's below that, I say, I'm going to triple whatever punishment I was going to do. Okay. So my kids would always oversell their punishment. Okay. But they had the choice to do it. Okay. And it just showed them, because that made them think about proportionality. Right. And so, I never had to triple or double or whatever else like that. The kids always hit a reasonable mark when it came to, again, showing, I know I did something wrong. Here's how I make amends.
Yeah. And it goes back to the accountability, right? Because I imagine they didn't come up with anything, too crazy, but it probably caused them to reflect on, okay, well, this is what I did. Again, these are the logical consequences for such an action, and I'm taking accountability for it.
100%. Okay. And again, like I said, they always gave something I was like, that makes sense. I never had to say that's not enough, or that's the way that's too much. It was always like, I think people have an intuitive sense of that. If they, we've had discussions their entire lives. We always talked about these kinds of things, so they had a good sense of that. And but the idea of accountability. I screwed up. Now I have a choice, or I have a chance. Sorry, to make a proportional amends.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, to that point, because I'm thinking about, you have daughters, I have a son. But I do think that it's important for parents to also understand that there are sex differences. So the way in which we punish a boy may be different than the way that we punish a girl, depending on the circumstances. I just read a case study just yesterday, actually, about this kid who, I think he was a grade 9 student, very bright kid, but he was having some social challenges when he entered high school. He was a very skilled football player, but his grades just were not cutting it. So, and I'll say this for context, I think that they were either a European or an Asian family. So they really valued academics, and they really valued his performance in school. So this was a really big deal to this family, long story short. And they didn't know what to do about this kid. So I think they sought some guidance from either their family doctor, their psychiatrist. It was from a physician. And they said, well, what do we do? And the doctor basically said, well, if the grades are important, that's fine. But whatever you do, you need to ensure that he is still engaging socially, just as you suggested, Oren. What this family ended up doing, though, was they took him out of football. They thought that if we take him out of football, this is something that he values. He'll smarten up, he'll get his grades up, and, everything will be fine. But in fact, what happened with this boy was his grades got even worse, because his motivation to do anything in school came from his ability to be on the football team. There's a cutoff. If he had a certain GPA below whatever the grade level was, he would be kicked off the team. So he was at least making, reaching that level. And this kid ended up getting into all kinds of trouble, got into drugs, behavior got worse, so on and so forth. So my point of sharing this story and this case study that I read about is being very aware of the fact that, what motivates boys may be different than what motivates girls, and your punishment needs to be in line with that.
Right. And what you said was so important about this idea that, that's why I was saying about the social contact and everything. If it's a sense of belonging, boys or girls, whichever, okay? Or it's a sense of identity or worth. If he got some sense of, self-worth from being on the football team, he's accomplishing, there's camaraderie.
For sure.
Yeah. Taking that away, in theory, on paper, it makes sense. Okay, he's going to strive to try to get that back. But no, before he gets to that point, he got hit by the other part of, I've just lost part of my identity. It's like if you're working at a job and you get fired, you just lost a part of your identity. So I think that's really, really important. And by the way, when it comes to punishments, and I've actually, sadly, I've had to do this with one of my children, which I never wanted to do. I take the phone away, but only temporarily, because I just know that, that it's distracting them and everything. I'm not doing it as a punishment. It's more, I tell her, I say, you just need to be able to focus for a certain period of time, or you can't have it before you go to bed. The blue light is keeping you awake and everything like that. Right. But I know so many parents at the beginning use that as a form of punishment, taking away the kid's phone. Well, a few things about that. For some parents, they take away the phone. The kid has equal access on their laptop or iPad, through the Messenger or whatever else they're using, or Snapchat, whatever, they can do it. So it's not a punishment. Okay. Or it's not effective. Number two, if they do take it away and they take away all their devices, and this research came out, I'm going to say about 15 years ago. even 15 years ago with adults, not kids, adults. They took away their phones. I'm going to speak between 10 and 15 years ago. Okay. Like I forget how many days they were supposed to do it for, but I'm not kidding. Within 24 hours, a whole bunch of these adults were going through actual withdrawal symptoms. They were irritable. Wow. They were, some of them were actually literally shaking. They had headaches. Okay. Their stomachs and everything. And that was for adults. Okay. And then, by the way, they still had regular phones and they had access to, I can't remember if they had the access to the internet or not. I think they had access to the internet. Mm-hmm. But back in those days, the internet didn't have the capabilities of, like the phone, right. The computers, like the phones. So they felt so disconnected from the world. So I say, now imagine a teen. And especially with FOMO, fear of missing out. Oh my God, if I'm not able to check and see what's going on or something's happening, I know that 90-something% I'm just making the number of the dynamics and the interactions are unhealthy there. Okay. But still that sense of belonging. So when you take away their phone, right, if it seems like it's for a week or a day, whatever, you've got to make sure that they don't feel lost. And it's not just social. So many kids today, right? If they need anything, the phone, they need to get from here to the grocery store. Okay, I'm going to Google Map it or something like that, right? Mm-hmm. They just feel so helpless without it. And you say, well, when we were kids, unfortunately, kids today are being raised in an environment that is alien to us. We get to watch the transition, right? But these kids didn't. Yeah. This is all that they know. Yeah. So you take away a phone, you might as well take away a body part. And I want to stress again that study was, I'm pretty sure, about 15 years ago, before the smartphones became that capable, 10 to 15 years, and it was with adults. So parents have to really understand that. Taking away temporarily so the kid has to do their schoolwork or whatever else, okay? And if it's going to be a whole day, let the kid have breaks in between just to check and see. Because again, adults do that as well. If they can't check their phone, how can you concentrate on homework or something when you're jonesing for your phone? Give them that little bit of time.
Yeah. So two things I want to say about that. So first of all, it's mildly concerning, but I get it. I understand this is their main lifeline, and so is true with adults as well. So that's fine. But I think what is perhaps at hand and what we can talk about a little bit here is how parents can effectively set boundaries when it comes to devices and phones and so on. A rule that we swear by, and our son had a phone maybe earlier than his friends did, but it was also to track where he is. So if he's going to the park by himself, we can track where he is and so on. But all of that aside, the rule from the get-go has been, your phone is ours at the end of the night, so it's not going in your bedroom. There's no electronic usage in bed. And, for the pragmatic reasons, like you said, the blue light is not good for their sleep. But also it's distracting. It can, disrupt their ability to fall asleep if they're worried about what's going on their phone. But if the precedent is set from the get-go that, at the end of the day, phones off, phones put away, I think that that's an important boundary to set.
It really is. And look, my wife and I, we've not been the greatest at times. Sometimes we do. And I know a lot of parents say that. They go like, it's so hard. And they get, they throw a tantrum. Whenever I had one patient, and I think she was 18. Okay. And I told her, like, I think we had a good enough relationship where I could mock her because her mother told me. I took away her phone and she threw a tantrum in the lane, in the front of the house, in front of neighbors and everything. Okay. So she came in. I joked with her about that, right? Because I wanted her to see just how ridiculous she was acting. She was acting like a child. And the whole thing was she was trying to prove how much of an adult she was. Anyway, the point I'm saying is that that even like an 18-year-old throwing a tantrum, right? The reason I'm bringing that up is the parent in the old days, she would have been so mortified, embarrassed, would have thought the child's going to have a stroke, so she would have given in, but she didn't give in. She maintained it, taught her, say that I'm tougher than you. I'm going to hold out and everything like that. And it's like a child, who says, I want ice cream. And the parent who finally breaks after the 350th time. Well, again, as I said at the beginning, you're conditioning the child that as long as they keep pushing hard enough, they will eventually get it. And the longer that you last before you finally break, the more powerful that lesson is. That kid just knows, I just got to keep going till the end of time. My parent's going to break before I do. And the parent's job is to make the kid think, no, I ain't breaking.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. So question number 5 is, and it's a really broad one. What is the number one rule of parenting? So I don't know if that's an answerable question. I don't think that there is a number one rule of parenting.
I disagree.
But I was going to say, but if I had to if I had to narrow it down to, I'll say 2 words, consistency and accountability, I think are the 2 biggest things that can be taught to a child.
Okay, excellent. I'm going to say something else that's going to kind of, I think, subsume everything. So you got consistency for sure. We know research shows that inconsistent parenting just messes up the kids' personalities and psychological functioning. Accountability, like that's what we always talk about for sure. I would say that part of that would also be structure. Okay. That's sort of along with consistency, but kids hate it, but they need it and they actually love it without knowing it, right?
For sure. Structure, predictability, kids.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly. They hate it, but they need
right.
it.
And because that gives them a sense of mastery. When there's structure out externally, they learn to internalize the structure. And by doing that, they gain a sense of mastery and the consistency, predictability, and so on, the repetition, they get a better sense of what the world looks like and how to operate within it. That's where the consistency comes in. So the one thing I was going to say when we talk about the number one rule, and we've talked before about this, which is basically you want to raise your kids to become independent adults, okay? Pro-social people who can function reasonably well in the world. So if that's your guiding light, right, then you can make sure everything sort of falls under that. And I tell this to my kids all the time. And I tell it to every parent. I say, the kid at 10 years old or 12 years old, if you say, you know what, when I'm getting you to wash your dishes, even though you don't want to do it, it's going to help you. And when you move out and blah, blah, the kid's going to go, it's white noise. They're not going to hear it. It's not going to make them feel better. But if you get in the habit of doing it and the kid hears it enough, it'll be white noise eventually. But it will get internalized and they may resist it. They may resent it. But at some point, they're going to really say, well, thank goodness my parents did that.
For sure. Yeah. Yeah. And I guess, as you're saying that, I'm thinking about my own childhood and many of those lessons. And in my 20s and my 30s, I'm like, oh, okay, that's why they did that.
Right. And I got to be frank, my parents, they never gave me that messaging. Like, this is why. It was always simply do it or else. Right. So, and look, I was well known. I went to 3 different high schools because I got kicked out of 2. So I was usually the worst kid in the school. Had the best grades, but so I was a problem child. Okay. I did everything bad that you can do almost everything bad that you can do as a teen. Right. So I was a whole handful and I was a nightmare for my parents. But the funny thing is certain things, and it was funny because here's this, really bad kid who's doing all these, he's infamous for being such a terrible kid and teen, whatever. Okay. A reprobate. But when it came to being home on time for dinner, people see the look of fear and death in my eye. Like, I don't care what I was doing. I don't care what state I was in. I'm rushing home. Okay. Or if it was a curfew late at night. Okay. Again, partying, doing this crazy stuff and oh shit, I got to get home. I'm running home and stuff like that. And that, I internalized that, not because it's going to help you, blah, blah. I was terrified. Okay. Of the consequences. I spent most of my teen years grounded. Okay. Just because of all the crap that I did. And again, the parenting that I was subject to was not what we're talking about. Let's put it that way. Okay. I'm trying to give the PG version, but the point is, again, even without the proper messaging, I internalize certain things. So if you deliver the message properly, kid might resist it, but really on some level, they are going to develop good, healthy habits that are going to help them function as they get older. And as older, we hope in the teen years and, not just like in their 20s or 30s, but even before then. So that's what they have to think about, right? How do I make my kid independent, basically?
And perhaps this is more of an offline conversation for us, but I'm always so fascinated about the difference between your upbringing and my upbringing, how you were as a kid and how I was like very vanilla, milk toasty, didn't do anything wrong. But as adults, we are so similar. It's really fascinating to me. Yeah. But in any event, as far as our usual question of, what can parents do about this? I think we've kind of been covering that throughout our questions here. But I would say in terms of the consumption of the bad parenting advice out there, view it with a critical mind, view it with a critical eye, and look at how does this fit with your family. Unfortunately, the vast majority of the parenting advice out there is not from experts. It's not from people who have, the education and expertise to be able to effectively guide parents, as evidenced by the example I started out the episode with. That being said, there's great value in learning about parenting from other parents. You don't only have to seek, the advice of experts. That's how parenting was passed on through generations, is through discussion and mentorship from other parents and grandparents and so on. So, there's beauty to that as well. But again, just be mindful and be critical of the media that you're consuming. And I hate to say it, but understand that maybe these content creators don't have your best interest in mind. It could just have to do with their views.
Exactly. And as I said earlier about, there's two things. One is, like I said, have self-compassion. Recognize that no matter what you see or do or what you try to do, you're not going to be perfect. You're going to fail a number of times. As long as you do everything in your power to make sure that you mitigate the damage. That's one thing. You're not perfect. Sounds great on paper. Okay. And number two, don't get defensive when you see what you're doing wrong, whether someone tells you directly, if another parent tells you, or you see it from a blog or something like that, try your best not to be defensive. It was so hard to do because as a parent, right, we don't want to think that we failed, right? That's why I say to my patients all the time, that's the first thing I say to them. I go, like I said about, I'm a parenting expert, but that's a joke almost, because I screw up all the time. I'm not afraid to say that, because if I don't say that, I'm not going to learn. You have to accept your flaws. So, but don't go too far and say, oh my God, I'm a horrible parent. I'll never be able to redeem myself. Right? We need, as always, we need some nuance and balance, and extremes are never healthy.
Yeah. So listeners, we want to know your parenting questions. I would love to do this same series, this episode again, as far as answering real parenting questions. So send us your comments, send us your feedback, and we'd be happy to answer any parenting questions you may have.
All right. And on that note, until next time, keep your eyes on the road and your hands upon the wheel.